Christianity's biggest split in centuries is set to happen tomorrow. Ukraine will create an independent Orthodox Church, totally separate from Russia's influence. Ukrainian religious leaders will hold a ceremony tomorrow, finalizing the split and establishing a new church with its own leader.
Ukraine sees the move as a national security issue, arguing it's the only way to be truly independent from Russia. So CBSN contributor Gabe Lipton is here to walk us through this story, and he writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZero Media. So, Gabe, this is a story that hasn't really been on our radar. So let's walk us through this, the significance of this split and why they're doing it now as opposed to 2015 when Russia annexed Crimea, and you think that's when they would want to sort of take a stand.
Yeah, this is sort of a spiritual battle with distinct worldly importance. Yeah. Basically what happened was the head of the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church in Istanbul in Turkey, announced back in October, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would be allowed independence from the Russian Orthodox Church, which has traditionally controlled Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians were very excited about this decision. They view Russia's control of their church, which has many worshippers in Ukraine, as a part of this sort of geopolitical conflict that has broken out between the two countries since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So it's a big decision. The Ukrainians are very excited about it. They view it as part of reasserting their own control over religious and cultural life in the country, and a way to sort of push back against Russia. And of course, the Kremlin is very upset about it.
So critics have argued that the reason the president, Petro Poroshenko, is doing this, it's because there's an upcoming presidential election. And we've had discussions about this when he imposed martial law. A lot of people said, as Anne-Marie posited in the first question, why didn't you do this back in 2015? Why are you only doing this on the eve of this election? Is it political?
So it's important to be clear that this was a decision of the Orthodox Church. They did it under a lot of pressure from the Ukrainians. And I think that it should boost him in advance of this election, and he's very excited about it. But it was in part a decision of this spiritual leader in Turkey.
But with the blessing of Poroshenko.
But of course with the blessing of Poroshenko. And the political context is that he is very excited about this ahead of the election, but also that as the Russians captured and there were skirmishes in seas between Russia and Ukraine, there's an ongoing geopolitical conflict, a very hot geopolitical conflict over the last 2 to 3 weeks that could be exacerbated by this sort of decision about religious and spiritual life between the two countries.
Is that why Russia cares? Is this sort of a battle for the hearts and minds of the people?
Absolutely. For Vladimir Putin, religion has traditionally been one of, if not the most important weapons in his geopolitical toolkit, in his national toolkit. Russians are very religious. It's a very religious country. They really trust the church, even when they don't necessarily always view Putin as sort of trustworthy, right? So he sees the church, he sees this as an embarrassment of sorts. He sees the church as very, very important to his support. There were big protests in 2011 and 2012 where he realized that he needed the church to gain support. For example, the Pussy Riot musicians staged this big protest in the main cathedral in Moscow. It was really cheered in the West as this sign of cultural openness. But in Russia, it wasn't viewed the same way. It was viewed as a real insult to the church, and people did not view it in the same way we did in the West. So I think that's an example of how important the church is to Vladimir Putin and to his political control of the country.
It sounds so medieval.
You read my mind. Right? How many times have we seen, dictators, sort of morph into saints, like recreate a narrative for themselves.
Using the church.
Right.
It reminded me when I first started to read this, it's like, everybody knows in 1534, Henry VIII, because citing overall influence from Rome, in England said, you know what, we're going to split off from the Roman Church and create our own church with the king as the supreme ruler of the
It's not that
Church
quite
of England.
extreme.
It's very strange. Yeah, it's very strange. I think what it speaks to is that in these countries, in Ukraine and Russia, where there are massive amounts of corruption, where maybe the economy's not doing well, these are institutions people trust, right? The church is still a massive part of their lives, everyday lives. So this fight over religion, which to us, to many in the West, seems sort of almost medieval, medieval, almost primordial, is really live. It's a really live issue, both geopolitically, politically, economically, right?
There's got to be some pushback, though. I know if, suddenly the country that I lived in said, you know what, you're part of another church right now, I would say, what would you mean?
Well, that's what that's why they called Queen Mary Bloody Mary. There was, if we're using the analogy of King Henry VIII in 1534 establishing himself as a supreme ruler of the Church of England to separate Rome's influence, yes, there were a lot of people who were Catholics who said, I don't want to be a Protestant.
Yeah.
So I think the real risk here is almost on the Russian side, that there's a backlash and people sort of rally to Vladimir Putin's side in the wake of this. And there have been reports over the past week of rising military action on the border of eastern Ukraine. There have been reports and discussions about a possible incursion that could rival maybe what happened in 2014. Now, there are many reasons to suggest that might not happen, but this is a really important military issue as well. And it could be a place where Putin spies an opening to say, look, they shouldn't have done this. This is another example of the West sort of pushing against Russian cultural, spiritual values, and he uses as an opening to sort of take another piece of Ukraine, or send in the little green men, as he does, who are not, don't have traditional military garb, but are causing conflict in the east of the country.